Welcome to Galactic Dream Station. Here we explore real encounters with the unexplained, collected from witnesses and hidden archives. If you enjoy these mysteries, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more. Now, find a quiet place, settle in, and let us begin tonight's account. Story 1. The Night Shift at Millbrook Steel. My name is Frank, and I worked the graveyard shift at Millbrook Steel Works for 37 years before I retired. This happened back in 1994. But I still think about it every damn night when I try to sleep. I was 52 then, been on nights for most of my career because the pay was better and I liked the quiet. Less supervisors breathing down your neck, you know. Just you and the machinery and the occasional safety walk through. The plant ran skeleton crews after midnight, maybe 8 guys total spread across the whole facility. That particular night in October, I was working the rolling mill section. Big place. Probably took you 5 minutes to walk from one end to the other. The mill itself was this massive beast of steel and iron that could flatten red-hot metal into sheets thin as paper. When it was running full tilt, the noise would shake your teeth loose. But around 2:30 in the morning, we had a scheduled maintenance break, so everything went quiet. That's when things got weird. First thing I noticed was my radio. We all carried these little Motorola walkie-talkies to stay in touch across the plant. Mine started crackling with this strange interference, like static but with a pattern to it. Almost musical, if that makes sense. I figured it was just electrical interference from the equipment cooling down, but then Jimmy Rodriguez called in from the furnace section. "Frank, you getting this weird shit on your radio?" "Yeah, sounds like a busted transmitter somewhere." "Nah man, this ain't equipment failure. Listen to it." I held my radio up and really focused on the sound. It wasn't random static. There was definitely a rhythm, almost like Morse code, but more complex. The pattern would repeat every 30 seconds or so, then shift to something slightly different. "Maybe someone's got their radio stuck on transmit?" I suggested, but I didn't really believe it. "All the other guys are hearing it too," Jimmy said. "Martinez thinks it's coming from outside the plant." I was about to respond when every light in my section went out. Not just dimmed, completely black. Emergency lighting should have kicked in immediately, but nothing. I stood there in total darkness, listening to that strange pattern on the radio getting louder and clearer. Then I saw the glow. It started as just a faint blue light coming through the high windows near the ceiling. At first I thought maybe it was a police car or ambulance outside, but the light was too steady, too bright. It filled the whole section with this cold, electric blue that made all the equipment look like it was underwater. I grabbed my flashlight and tried to turn it on. Dead, shook it, smacked it, nothing. The radio was still crackling with that pattern, getting so loud now I had to turn the volume down. That's when I heard footsteps, not work boots on concrete like you'd expect. These were soft, almost like bare feet, but with a wet sound to them. They were coming from the direction of the main entrance, slow and deliberate. I called out, thinking maybe it was one of the other guys coming to check on the power situation. "Jimmy Martinez, that you?" The footsteps stopped. The blue light got brighter, and I could see shapes moving outside the windows. Not people shapes. These were tall and thin, maybe 8 feet high, moving in this smooth way that didn't look natural, like they were floating just above the ground. I backed up against the control panel for the rolling mill, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it over the radio static. The wet footstep sounds started again, closer now. I could hear them squelching on the concrete floor, like someone walking through puddles, but we hadn't had rain in weeks. The radio crackled, and Jimmy's voice came through, but it sounded wrong, distorted and slow, like a record playing at the wrong speed. "Frank, where are—" "I'm in rolling mill section," I whispered. "Something's in here with me." "No one here, Frank, building empty." That made no sense. I'd seen at least 3 other guys when I came on shift. Martinez, Jimmy, Thompson, couple others. How could the building be empty? The blue light suddenly got so bright I had to close my eyes. When I opened them, there was something standing about 20 feet away from me. I can't describe it properly because my brain kept trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was tall, maybe 7.5 feet, but thin like a scarecrow. The skin, if you could call it that, looked gray and wet, like it was covered in some kind of slime. The head was too big for the body, shaped like an upside-down teardrop, and where the eyes should have been were just these black holes that seemed to go on forever. It didn't move for maybe 30 seconds, just stood there looking at me. I couldn't move either, couldn't even breathe properly. Then it raised one arm, and I saw the hand had too many fingers, long and thin like spider legs. It pointed at me. The radio exploded with sound, not static now but voices. Dozens of voices all talking at once in languages I didn't recognize. Some sounded human, others definitely weren't. I could hear crying, screaming, what sounded like mechanical beeping and whirring. Then everything went quiet. The blue light faded, the thing was gone, and my flashlight suddenly worked again. I swept the beam around the section, but I was alone. The radio was dead silent, not even the usual background chatter from the night dispatcher. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I dropped my flashlight and ran for the main exit, expecting to find the other guys, maybe get some explanation for what had just happened. The parking lot was empty except for my truck. All the other cars were gone. Jimmy's beat-up Chevy, Martinez's Honda, Thompson's motorcycle. Gone, like they'd never been there. I drove home and called in sick for the rest of the week. When I finally went back to work, I asked around about that night. Nobody remembered working with me. The shift supervisor said I'd been alone in the plant, that they'd had to cut the crew down to one man due to budget constraints. But I knew that wasn't right. I remembered talking to Jimmy on the radio, seeing the other guys during shift change. The supervisor showed me the logbook though, and sure enough, only my name was written down for that night. I worked at Millbrook for 13 more years after that, but I never took another night shift. Always found excuses, took pay cuts, whatever it took to avoid being alone in that place after dark. The weird thing is, about 6 months later, I was having a beer with some guys from the day shift, and Martinez mentioned something strange. He said he'd had the weirdest dream where he was working nights at the plant, and something scared the hell out of him. Described the blue light, the radio static, everything. Then Thompson said he'd had a similar dream. Then Jimmy. We all looked at each other, and nobody said anything else about it. But I could see in their eyes that they remembered. Somehow, we'd all been there that night, and somehow, we'd all been erased from it except for me. I still don't know what that thing was or what it wanted. Maybe it was studying us, maybe it was just passing through, and we happened to be in the way. All I know is that night changed something fundamental about how I see the world. There are things out there that don't follow our rules, don't care about our understanding of reality. They can reach into our lives, take people, change history, and leave just enough traces behind to drive you crazy wondering if it really happened. I'm 73 now, and I've never told this story to anyone except my wife. She believes me, thank God, because living with this alone would have killed me years ago. But sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I hear that pattern again. Faint, like it's coming from very far away, but it's the same rhythm I heard on the radio that night. And I wonder if they're still out there, still watching, still taking people from places where nobody will notice they're gone until it's too late. Story 2. Assembly line anomaly. So this is gonna sound totally insane, but I swear on my grandmother's grave that this actually happened. I'm 24, work at this electronics assembly plant outside Phoenix called Technocore Industries. We make circuit boards for smartphones and tablets, super boring stuff. But the pay is decent, and they don't drug test, which is basically all I care about. I've been there for about 2 years now, mostly working day shifts, but last month my supervisor asked if I wanted to pick up some overtime on the weekend night crew. Extra money sounded good because I'm trying to save up to move out of my parents' place, so I said sure. The night shift is way different from days. During the day there's 150 people running around, supervisors everywhere, constant noise and activity. But nights, it's maybe 20 people total spread across this huge facility. Way more chill, you can actually listen to music while you work, and the managers mostly leave you alone as long as production numbers look okay. My job is pretty simple. I sit at this workstation and install these tiny processors onto motherboards. The boards come down this conveyor belt, I grab one, use this special tool to place the processor in the right spot, then send it down to the next station where someone else does soldering. Rinse and repeat for 8 hours. The weird stuff started happening around my 3rd weekend on nights. It was probably 2 in the morning, and I was in that zone where your hands are working automatically but your brain is somewhere else. I had my earbuds in, listening to some podcast about conspiracy theories, when I noticed the conveyor belt had stopped. That happens sometimes when there's a jam down the line or someone needs to fix something, so I didn't think much of it. I took my earbuds out and looked around to see if anyone was signaling about what was going on. The whole factory floor was empty. I mean, completely empty. No people at any of the workstations, no supervisors walking around, nothing. But here's the really weird part, all the equipment was still running. Conveyor belts at other stations were moving, machines were humming and beeping, lights were flashing on the control panels. It was like everyone had just vanished in the middle of working. I stood up and called out, "Hello, anyone here?" My voice echoed in this creepy way it never did when people were around. I walked over to the next workstation where this girl named Ashley usually worked. Her chair was still warm, and there was a half-eaten sandwich on her desk, like she'd just stepped away for a second. I checked a few more stations and found the same thing. Personal stuff left behind, drinks still cold, computers logged in and running programs. But no people anywhere. I was starting to freak out a little, so I headed toward the break room thinking maybe everyone had gone there for some reason. The hallways felt different without people in them, more echoey and cold. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter too, casting these harsh shadows that moved weird when I walked under them. The break room was empty, but the TV was on, playing some late-night infomercial with the volume turned way down. I grabbed my phone to call my supervisor, but I had no signal. Not unusual in the factory since the walls are thick metal, but still frustrating. I decided to go outside and try calling from the parking lot. Maybe there was some kind of emergency evacuation I'd missed because I had my earbuds in. But when I got to the main entrance, the doors wouldn't open. They're electronic locks that need a badge scan, and mine wasn't working. The little light just stayed red no matter how many times I waved my badge at it. I tried the emergency exit, but same thing. Red light, no response. That's when I started to panic for real. I ran back to the factory floor, thinking maybe I'd missed someone. Maybe they were in the bathroom or the supply room or something. But as I came around the corner into the main assembly area, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. All the workstations were occupied again, but not by people. These things were sitting at every station, working on the circuit boards just like we normally did. They were roughly human-shaped but wrong in every way that mattered. Too tall, too thin, with these long spindly arms that bent in places arms shouldn't bend. Their skin looked gray and smooth like plastic, and their heads were shaped like elongated eggs with no visible features except these black holes where eyes should be. They moved in perfect synchronization like they were all connected to the same brain. Pick up board, install component, pass it along, repeat. No wasted motion, no pausing, no individual variation. It was hypnotic and terrifying at the same time. I ducked behind a support pillar and watched them work. They were fast, way faster than any human could be, but also incredibly precise. Every movement was exactly the same, time to the second. The conveyor belts were moving at like triple normal speed, but they kept up effortlessly. One of them turned its head toward where I was hiding. I held my breath, pressing myself against the pillar, hoping it hadn't seen me. But then another one turned and another, until all of them were looking in my direction. They didn't stop working, their hands kept moving through the assembly motions, but every single head was pointed at me. I ran. I don't remember much about the next few minutes except running through hallways, trying doors, looking for any way out of the building. Everything was locked, every exit sealed. I ended up in the supply closet on the second floor, hiding behind boxes of electronic components, trying not to hyperventilate. I could hear them moving around downstairs. Not footsteps exactly, more like a sliding sound, like they were gliding across the floor. And there was this humming noise, not mechanical but organic, like a bunch of people humming the same tune, but slightly off-key. I stayed in that closet for what felt like hours, checking my phone every few minutes. Still no signal, and the time display was acting weird, jumping forward and backward randomly. At one point it said 3:15 a.m., then a minute later it said 1:47 a.m. Eventually the sound stopped, and I worked up the courage to peek out of the closet. The factory floor was back to normal. Well, normal except for being empty. No sign of those things, no evidence they'd ever been there. The workstations looked exactly like they had when I first noticed everyone was gone. I went back to my station and sat down, not knowing what else to do. My earbuds were still on the desk where I'd left them, the podcast still paused at the same spot. According to my phone, only about 10 minutes had passed since I first noticed the conveyor belt had stopped. Then people started coming back, not all at once, but gradually. Ashley appeared at her station like she'd just returned from the bathroom. A guy named Marcus came walking down the aisles carrying a cup of coffee. Within about 5 minutes, everyone was back at their posts, acting like nothing had happened. I asked Ashley where she'd been. "Been where? I've been right here all night." "But you were gone." Everyone was gone. The whole floor was empty. She looked at me like I was crazy. "Dude, I've been sitting right there for the past 3 hours. Are you feeling okay?" I asked a few other people, got the same response. Nobody remembered leaving their stations. Nobody had seen anything unusual. According to them, I was the one who'd disappeared for 10 minutes. The rest of the shift passed normally, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept looking around, expecting to see those things again, expecting everyone to vanish. When 7 a.m. finally came and day shift started arriving, I was so relieved I almost cried. I didn't say anything to my supervisor about what happened. How could I? Hey boss, I saw a bunch of alien things doing our jobs while everyone else mysteriously disappeared, but nobody remembers it happening. Yeah, that would go over real well. But I started paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. Like how the production numbers for night shift were always significantly higher than day shift, even though we had way fewer people. Or how the quality control reports showed 0 defects on boards processed during the early morning hours, which should be statistically impossible. I also started researching Technocore Industries online. Turns out the company has been around for only 5 years, but they've got contracts with every major tech company in the world. Their growth has been described as unprecedented and technologically inexplicable by industry analysts. The building we work in used to be a different factory that closed down in the early 2000s. Before that, it was a military research facility. And before that, according to some old newspaper articles I found, it was the site of several UFO sightings in the 1960s. I've been back on night shift 3 more times since then, and it's happened twice more. Same thing, everyone disappears, those things take over the assembly line, then everyone comes back like nothing happened. The last time, I managed to take a video with my phone, but when I watched it later, it was just footage of empty workstations. No sign of the creatures. I'm thinking about quitting, but the money is really good, and jobs are hard to find right now. Plus, part of me is curious. What are those things? Where do the people go when they disappear? Why is this happening? I've been reading a lot about alien abduction stories, and there are some similarities. Missing time, electronic interference, beings that look almost human but not quite. But most abduction stories happen to people who are alone in remote areas. This is happening in the middle of a factory with 20 other people around. Maybe that's the point. Maybe they need us there to make it work somehow. Maybe we're not just witnesses, maybe we're part of whatever they're doing. All I know is that I'm going to keep working nights for a while longer. If something this big is happening, someone needs to document it, even if nobody believes me. And who knows, maybe I'll figure out a way to communicate with them, find out what they want. Or maybe they'll decide they don't need us anymore, and I'll end up like the people in those missing time periods, gone without anyone remembering I was ever there. Either way, it's the most interesting thing that's ever happened to me, and I'm not ready to walk away from it yet. Story 3. Third shift supervisor. I need to get this written down before I lose my nerve. Been carrying this around for 6 months now, and it's eating me alive. My name is Linda Morrison. I'm 43 years old, and I supervise the third shift at Meridian Automotive Parts in Akron, Ohio. Been with the company for 18 years, worked my way up from assembly line to floor supervisor. I've seen everything you can imagine in a manufacturing environment, but nothing prepared me for what happened last spring. We make brake components for Ford and GM, mostly routine stuff. But the work requires precision because people's lives depend on what we produce. I take that responsibility seriously, maybe more than I should. My crew knows I don't tolerate shortcuts or sloppy work, but I also make sure they know I've got their backs when corporate starts pushing unrealistic deadlines. The night in question was April 15th, a Tuesday. I remember because it was tax day and half my crew was grumbling about having to file extensions. We were running a full shift, 22 people spread across 4 production lines. Normal night, normal crew, nothing out of the ordinary until around midnight. That's when the power fluctuations started. At first it was just the lights dimming for a few seconds, then coming back to normal. Happens sometimes when the electrical grid gets overloaded, especially during hot weather, though April was still pretty cool. I made a note to call maintenance in the morning, but it wasn't affecting production, so I didn't worry about it. Then the computers started acting up. Our quality control stations run on these industrial PCs that track every component we produce. Serial numbers, batch codes, test results, everything gets logged automatically. But around 12:30, they all started displaying error messages I'd never seen before. Not Windows errors, something else entirely. Lines of text in what looked like mathematical equations mixed with symbols that weren't even letters. I called our IT contractor, but of course nobody was available at that hour. The machines were still running, so I told my crew to keep working, and we'd sort out the computer issues in the morning. But I was starting to feel uneasy about the whole situation. Then Maria Santos came running over from line 3 with a look on her face I'd never seen before. Maria's been with us for 12 years, steady as a rock, never gets rattled by anything, but she was pale and shaking, barely able to get words out. Linda, you need to see this. Something's wrong with the parts. I followed her back to her station, expecting to find some kind of manufacturing defect, or maybe a problem with the raw materials. What I saw instead made no sense at all. The brake rotors coming off line 3 were perfect, not just good quality, perfect. Every single one was identical down to the microscopic level, with surface finishes that looked like they'd been polished by hand for hours. The tolerances were so precise they were actually better than our specifications called for. That might sound like a good thing, but in manufacturing, parts that are too perfect can be just as problematic as parts that are defective. Everything has natural variation, even with the best equipment and controls. When you see parts that are absolutely identical, it usually means something is very wrong with your process. I checked the other lines and found the same thing. Every component was flawless, every measurement exactly on target, every surface finish perfect. It was like the machines had suddenly become capable of producing parts with impossible precision. But here's the really weird part. When I looked at the production counters, we were running at about 150% of normal output. The lines weren't moving any faster, the crew wasn't working any harder, but somehow we were producing significantly more parts than should have been possible. I was trying to figure out how to explain this in my shift report when the temperature started dropping. It wasn't gradual, it was sudden and dramatic. Within about 10 minutes, the factory floor went from a comfortable 70 degrees to maybe 45 degrees. I could see my breath, and some of the crew started putting on jackets and sweatshirts. The heating system was running, I could hear it cycling, but it wasn't making any difference. That's when I noticed the silence. Manufacturing plants are never quiet. There's always noise from machinery, ventilation systems, forklifts moving around, people talking. But gradually all the background noise had faded away until the only sounds were our production lines running. No HVAC noise, no electrical hum, no traffic from the highway outside, just the rhythmic sounds of our equipment operating in this strange, cold silence. I was about to call the plant manager at home when I saw them. They were standing in the shadows near the loading dock, just outside the reach of our work lights. 3 figures, tall and thin, wearing what looked like white coveralls or lab coats. At first I thought they might be corporate inspectors or safety auditors. Sometimes they show up unannounced to check on third shift operations. But something about the way they stood was wrong. Too still, too perfectly aligned. Like mannequins positioned by someone with no understanding of how people actually stand and move. I walked toward them, planning to ask who they were and what they were doing in my facility without authorization. As I got closer, I could see they weren't wearing coveralls at all. What I'd thought was white clothing was actually their skin, pale and smooth like porcelain. They were tall, maybe 6.5 feet, with proportions that were almost human but not quite right. Arms too long, heads too large, fingers that extended past where fingers should end. When I was about 20 feet away, they turned to look at me in perfect unison. I can't describe their faces because they didn't really have faces. Just smooth expanses of that white skin with indentations where eyes and a mouth should have been. But somehow I knew they were looking at me, studying me, evaluating me for some purpose I couldn't understand. I stopped walking and called out, "Excuse me, this is a restricted area. I need to see some identification." They didn't respond, didn't move, just continued staring at me with those non-existent eyes. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and I realized I couldn't hear my production lines anymore. Everything had gone completely silent. I turned around to check on my crew and saw something that made my blood freeze. Everyone was still at their stations, still going through the motions of working, but they were moving in slow motion, like a movie played at quarter speed. Their hands moved gradually through the assembly processes, their heads turned slowly when they looked at something. Even their blinking was slowed down to a crawl. But the machines were running at normal speed, producing parts faster than ever, with that impossible perfection I'd noticed earlier. I looked back toward the loading dock, but the 3 figures were gone. In their place was a soft blue light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the factory with this cold, electric glow that made everything look like it was underwater. I tried to walk back to my crew, but my legs felt like they were moving through thick liquid. Each step took enormous effort, and I could feel time stretching around me like taffy. My watch had stopped at 12:57, but I had the sense that hours were passing while I struggled to cross 30 feet of factory floor. When I finally reached Maria's station, she was frozen in the middle of reaching for a component. Her hand was suspended in midair, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. I tried to touch her shoulder, but my hand passed right through her like she was made of smoke. That's when I understood. I wasn't in the same time stream as my crew anymore. They were still working their shift, but I was somewhere else, someone else, watching it happen from outside normal reality. The blue light got brighter, and I could see shapes moving through it. Not the white figures from before, but something else, mechanical looking, with multiple arms and appendages that moved with fluid precision. They were working alongside my crew, or maybe instead of my crew, I couldn't tell which. They were installing components into the brake assemblies, but not components from our inventory. These were different, more complex, with surfaces that seemed to shift and change as I watched them. Some appeared to be made of metal, others looked organic, and a few seemed to be constructed from pure light. I realized they were modifying our products, adding technology that didn't belong in brake systems, maybe didn't belong on Earth at all. Every part that came off our lines was being altered in ways that would be invisible to normal inspection, but would fundamentally change how they functioned. I tried to scream, tried to warn someone, but no sound came out. I was a ghost in my own factory, watching something terrible happen to products that would end up in thousands of vehicles, affecting millions of people who would never know their cars had been touched by something not of this world. The blue light began to fade, and gradually I could hear the normal sounds of the factory returning. The mechanical figures dissolved back into the light, the temperature started rising, and my crew began moving at normal speed again. I was standing next to Maria when she looked up and saw me. "Oh, hi Linda. When did you come over here?" I checked my watch. It was 12:58. 1 minute had passed. "Maria, do you remember anything unusual happening in the last few minutes?" She looked confused. "No, just been working on these rotors." "Why?" I asked several other crew members the same question. None of them remembered the temperature drop, the silence, the blue light, or the time distortion. According to them, I'd been making my normal rounds, checking on production, same as every night. But when I looked at our output numbers, we'd produced twice our normal quota in that single minute, and every single part was perfect. I spent the rest of the shift trying to act normal, but inside I was screaming. I kept thinking about all those brake components going out to dealerships, being installed in cars driven by families, by children. What were those things doing to our products? What would happen when those modified parts were put to the test in real-world conditions? I filed my shift report like always, but I didn't mention anything unusual. How could I? Who would believe me? And what if I was wrong? What if it was some kind of hallucination brought on by stress or exhaustion? But deep down I knew it was real. Over the next few weeks, I started researching our company's history, looking for any clues that might explain what I'd witnessed. Meridian Automotive has been around since 1968, but there are gaps in the corporate records. Periods where production numbers don't match shipment records, times when we apparently manufactured components for vehicles that don't exist in any automotive database. I also started paying attention to recall notices and safety bulletins from Ford and GM. There's been an unusual number of brake-related incidents lately, but not failures exactly. More like cases where the braking systems perform beyond their designed specifications, stopping vehicles in impossibly short distances, sometimes preventing accidents that should have been unavoidable. The media reports these as positive stories, miraculous saves, technology working better than expected. But I know the truth. Those aren't our brake components performing better than designed. Those are hybrid systems, part human engineering and part something else, something that understands physics in ways we don't. I've been back on third shift dozens of times since then, and it's happened 3 more times. Same pattern. Same blue light, same impossible production numbers. Each time, I'm the only one who remembers it happening. Each time, I watch those mechanical figures modify our products with technology that shouldn't exist. I've thought about quitting, about reporting it to someone, about trying to sabotage the production lines to prevent those modified parts from reaching the public. But what if I'm wrong? What if those modifications are actually making vehicles safer? What if this is some kind of benevolent intervention, aliens or time travelers or whatever they are trying to prevent accidents and save lives? Or what if it's something much worse and I'm the only person in a position to witness it and potentially stop it? I don't know what to do. I keep working, keep documenting everything I can, keep hoping that someday I'll understand what's really happening and why I'm the only one who can see it. All I know for certain is that the world is much stranger and more dangerous than most people realize, And sometimes the things that are supposed to protect us are being influenced by forces we can't comprehend. I just pray that whatever they're doing, they have our best interests at heart. Story 4. Graveyard at the bottling plant. You ever work in a place that just feels wrong? Not like haunted or nothing, just wrong. Like the building itself is holding its breath waiting for something bad to happen. That's how I felt about Clearwater Beverages from day one. But a job's a job and I needed the money. Name's Bobby Hutchins. Been working factory jobs since I got out of high school back in '03. Clearwater hired me last year to run their night shift bottling operation. We bottle everything from soda to energy drinks to that fancy alkaline water rich people pay $5 for. Simple enough work, just make sure the machines keep running and the bottles don't jam up on the conveyor lines. The plant sits out on Route 47 about 10 miles east of town, surrounded by nothing but cornfields and a few abandoned farmhouses. Built in the '70s, looks like every other industrial building you've ever seen. Gray concrete walls, flat roof, parking lot full of potholes. During the day it's busy enough, maybe 60 people working different shifts, but at night it's just me and maybe 2 other guys keeping an eye on things. I'd been there about 6 months when the weird stuff started. It was late November, cold enough that you could see your breath when you walked between buildings. I was doing my usual rounds, checking the bottling lines, making sure the quality control sensors were working right. Everything seemed normal until I got to Line 4. Line 4 was shut down for maintenance, had been for about a week. Some problem with the capping mechanism that the day shift mechanics couldn't figure out. But when I walked past it that night, the line was running. Not just running, running fast. Bottles flying down the conveyor at twice normal speed, getting filled and capped and labeled like nothing was wrong. I figured maybe the mechanics had fixed it and forgot to update the work order, so I went to check the production computer. According to the system, Line 4 was still offline, showing 0 output for the past week, but I could see bottles coming off the end of the line, getting sorted into cases, stacking up on pallets. I called my supervisor, guy named Pete who covers nights from his house. Told him Line 4 was running but not showing up in the system. He said that was impossible, the line was locked out and tagged for safety. No way it could be operational. Pete, I'm standing right here looking at it. It's running. Bubby, you sure you're looking at the right line? Maybe it's Line 3 you're seeing. I walked over and checked the line number painted on the floor. Definitely Line 4. Nope, it's 4. Running like a bat out of hell. Long pause on the phone. All right, I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't touch anything until I get there. While I waited for Pete, I decided to get a closer look at what was coming off the line. The bottles looked normal enough, clear plastic with the standard Clearwater label. But when I picked one up to read the label, the text was wrong. Instead of Clearwater Pure Spring Water, it said something I couldn't pronounce. Long words with too many consonants, like someone had taken a foreign language and mixed it with a computer error. The nutrition facts were replaced with symbols that looked almost like mathematical equations, but not quite. I grabbed a few more bottles from different parts of the pallet. All of them had the same weird labeling, but in different languages or symbol systems. Some looked vaguely Asian, others were completely alien to me. One bottle had what appeared to be star charts on the label, with lines connecting different points like constellation maps. The liquid inside looked like water, but when I held the bottle up to the light, it seemed to move on its own. Not flowing like normal liquid, but shifting and swirling in patterns that didn't match the movement of the bottle. And it was glowing, very faintly, with a blue-green light that reminded me of those deep-sea documentaries where they show fish that make their own light. Pete showed up right on schedule, but when we got to Line 4, it was shut down. Completely quiet, safety tags still in place, no bottles anywhere. The pallets I'd seen were gone, the conveyor was empty, and the production computer still showed the line as offline. Bobby, you feeling all right? You been getting enough sleep? I looked around, trying to figure out what had happened to all the bottles I'd seen. Pete, I swear to you, this line was running 20 minutes ago. I've got bottles in my truck to prove it. We went out to the parking lot, but my truck was empty. No bottles, no evidence of anything unusual. Pete gave me this look like he was deciding whether to send me home or call for a drug test. Look, you've been working a lot of overtime lately. Maybe you should take a couple days off, get some rest. I wanted to argue, but what was I gonna say? That I'd seen a ghost production line making bottles with alien writing, that the water inside was glowing. He already thought I was losing it. Yeah, maybe you're right. I'll take tomorrow night off. But I didn't take the night off. I came back the next evening and parked across the road in the abandoned farmhouse driveway where I could watch the plant without being seen. Brought a thermos of coffee and my dad's old binoculars. Figured I'd do a little surveillance and see if I could spot anything unusual. Around 2 in the morning, the whole plant started glowing. Not the normal security lights, this was different. Blue-green light coming from inside the building, bright enough that I could see it through the small windows near the roof. The same color as the liquid I'd seen in those bottles. I drove closer and parked behind the building where my truck wouldn't be visible from the road. The employee entrance was still locked, but I had my key card and the alarm code. Figured if anyone asked, I'd say I came in to check on something. The inside of the plant was like nothing I'd ever seen. All 4 bottling lines were running, but they weren't making the products we normally produced. Each line was filling bottles with different colored liquids. Line 1 had that blue-green glowing stuff I'd seen before. Line 2 was producing something that looked like liquid silver, flowing and shifting like mercury but brighter. Line 3 was filling bottles with what appeared to be pure light, so bright I couldn't look directly at it. Line 4 was running a liquid that seemed to absorb light, making the bottles look like they contained pieces of night sky. And the bottles themselves were different. Not our standard plastic containers, but something that looked like crystal or maybe glass, but too perfect to be either. They caught and reflected the light in ways that hurt to look at, like they were made from some kind of material that didn't follow normal optical rules. The strangest part was the workers. There were people operating the lines, but they weren't anyone I recognized from our crew. They were tall, maybe 6.5 feet, wearing white coveralls that seemed to glow with their own light. Their movements were too smooth, too coordinated, like they were all connected to the same brain. I hid behind a support column and watched them work. They moved with incredible efficiency, never wasting motion, never pausing or hesitating. When bottles jammed on the conveyor, which happened regularly, they would fix the problem before it even fully developed, like they could predict mechanical failures before they occurred. One of them turned and looked directly at where I was hiding. I held my breath, pressing myself against the concrete column, hoping I was invisible in the shadows. But those eyes, if you could call them eyes, seemed to see right through the concrete. They were black, completely black, like looking into deep water at night. The figure raised one hand, and all the machinery stopped at exactly the same moment. The sudden silence was deafening after the constant noise of the production lines. Then it pointed at me. I ran. Didn't think about it, didn't try to be sneaky, just ran for the exit as fast as I could move. Behind me I could hear footsteps, but not normal footsteps. These sounded wet, like someone walking through puddles, but the factory floor was dry. I made it to my truck and got out of there, driving way too fast down Route 47 until I was back in town. Didn't slow down until I was sitting in the parking lot of the 24-hour diner, shaking so hard I could barely hold my coffee cup. I called in sick for the rest of the week, told them I had the flu. Spent the time researching Clearwater Beverages, trying to find some explanation for what I'd seen. The company has an interesting history. Founded in 1976 by a guy named Marcus Clearwater, but there's almost no information about him online. The business grew incredibly fast, went from a small local operation to national distribution in less than 5 years. They've got contracts with major retailers across the country, but their product line keeps changing in ways that don't make sense from a business perspective. I also found some weird news stories from the area over the years. Reports of strange lights in the sky near the plant, livestock behaving oddly on nearby farms, people claiming to have lost time while driving past the facility. Most of the stories were buried in the back pages of local newspapers, the kind of thing editors probably thought were too crazy to take seriously. But the most disturbing thing I found was a pattern in the company's employment records. High turnover rate, especially on night shift. People would work there for a few months, then suddenly quit without notice. No forwarding addresses, no references to other jobs, just gone. I started wondering how many other people had seen what I'd seen and what had happened to them afterward. When I finally went back to work, I decided to keep my mouth shut and my eyes open. I did my job, filed my reports, acted like nothing had happened. But I paid attention to things I'd never noticed before, like how our production numbers never quite matched our shipment records. We'd produce 10,000 cases of water in a week, but ship 12,000. The extra inventory would just appear in our warehouse, already palletized and ready for distribution. Or how some of our regular customers would place orders for products that weren't in our catalog. Special formulations with names I'd never heard of, shipped to addresses that didn't exist when I looked them up online. The night shift supervisor job started feeling less like work and more like being a security guard for something I wasn't supposed to see. I'd do my rounds, check the normal production lines, file my reports, and pretend I didn't notice the blue-green glow coming from the sealed-off sections of the building. But sometimes, late at night when the plant was quiet, I'd hear sounds from those areas. Machinery running that shouldn't exist, voices speaking in languages that didn't sound human, and underneath it all, a low humming noise that seemed to come from the building itself. I've been thinking about quitting, but part of me needs to know what's really going on. Maybe Clearwater Beverages is just a front for something bigger, something connected to those lights people see in the sky. Maybe those bottles with the strange labels are being distributed somewhere, to someone for purposes I can't imagine. All I know is that the water we drink, the products we trust, might not be what we think they are. And somewhere out there, in factories and plants just like this one, people are working night shifts and seeing things that don't make sense, things that challenge everything we believe about reality. The question is, what do we do with that knowledge? And how long before they decide we know too much? Story 5: Quality Control. You know what's funny about working in manufacturing? People think it's all about making things, but really it's about controlling things. Controlling processes, controlling quality, controlling variables that could mess up your product. I've been doing quality control for automotive electronics for 15 years, and I thought I understood control until I started working at Apex Components. My name is Jennifer Walsh, I'm 38, and I've got a degree in electrical engineering from Ohio State. I've worked for Ford, GM, couple smaller suppliers, always in quality assurance, making sure the parts that go into cars actually work the way they're supposed to. It's detail-oriented work, requires patience and precision, but I'm good at it. Apex hired me last year to manage their night shift QC department. We test electronic control modules for hybrid and electric vehicles, the kind of components that manage battery systems and electric motors. Critical stuff, because if these parts fail, you're not just dealing with a broken-down car. You could be looking at fires or explosions. The facility is in suburban Detroit, about 20 minutes from where I live. Modern building, clean rooms, expensive test equipment, everything you'd expect from a high-end electronics manufacturer. During the day it's bustling with engineers and technicians, but night shift is quieter. Just me and 3 technicians running automated tests on components that come off the production lines. The work is mostly routine. Components come to us in batches. We run them through a series of electrical tests, check their performance against specifications, then either pass them for shipment or flag them for rework. Most nights we process maybe 200 units, takes about 6 hours if everything runs smoothly. But about 3 months ago, things stopped running smoothly. It started with test failures that didn't make sense. We'd get a batch of control modules from the production line, all manufactured the same day from the same materials, but some would test perfectly while others would show bizarre electrical characteristics that shouldn't have been possible. For example, we'd test the voltage regulation circuit and get readings that were exactly twice what they should have been, but the component would still function normally. Or we'd measure current draw and find that some modules were actually generating power instead of consuming it, which violates basic laws of physics. At first I thought we had calibration issues with our test equipment. I ran diagnostics on all our instruments, brought in outside technicians to verify our measurements, even sent some questionable components to an independent lab for verification. The independent lab confirmed our results. Some of these components were performing in ways that were scientifically impossible, but they were still passing all functional tests. I reported this to my supervisor, a guy named David Chen who's been with Apex for about 10 years. He seemed concerned but not surprised, which struck me as odd. Most quality managers would be freaking out about test results that defied physics. Jennifer, I need you to create a separate category for these anomalous units. Don't reject them, just flag them as Category X and set them aside for special handling. David, these components are showing impossible electrical characteristics. We can't ship them to customers without understanding what's causing these readings. I understand your concerns, but we've been dealing with this issue for a while. There are people above my pay grade who handle Category X components. Your job is to identify them and segregate them, nothing more. That should have been the end of it. I should have just followed instructions and minded my own business. But I've been in quality control too long to ignore data that doesn't make sense. I started keeping detailed records of every Category X component we identified. Serial numbers, test results, manufacturing dates, everything. I also started staying late after my shift to run additional tests, trying to understand what was causing these impossible readings. What I found was even more disturbing than the original anomalies. The Category X components weren't just showing unusual electrical characteristics. They were changing over time. A module that tested normal on Monday would show impossible readings on Tuesday, then revert to normal on Wednesday, like they were evolving or adapting in response to our testing. I also noticed that the components seemed to be communicating with each other. When I tested multiple Category X units at the same time, they would synchronize their behavior, all showing identical readings even though they were manufactured weeks apart. But the really weird part was what happened when I tried to document this behavior with video. I set up a camera to record the test process, thinking I could show David visual evidence of what was happening. But when I reviewed the footage, it showed completely normal test results. The impossible readings I was seeing with my own eyes weren't appearing on camera. I tried different cameras, different angles, even brought in my personal smartphone to record the test displays. Same result every time. The video would show routine testing with normal results, while I was simultaneously witnessing readings that violated fundamental laws of electronics. That's when I started to suspect the problem wasn't with the components. I scheduled an appointment with my doctor, thinking maybe I was having vision problems or neurological issues that were causing me to misread the test displays. But my exam came back completely normal. 20/20 vision, no signs of any medical problems that could explain what I was experiencing. I also started researching Apex components more thoroughly, looking for any clues about their manufacturing processes or corporate history that might explain these anomalies. The company was founded in 2008, right after the financial crisis, by a group of investors with backgrounds in aerospace and defense contracting. They grew incredibly quickly, securing major contracts with automotive companies within their first year of operation. Their technology was described as revolutionary and years ahead of the competition, but there were very few details about their actual innovations. I also found some interesting patent filings associated with Apex. Most were for standard electronic components, but a few described technologies that seemed to be based on principles I didn't recognize. References to quantum field manipulation and nonlinear energy conversion that sounded more like science fiction than electrical engineering. But the most disturbing discovery was buried in a technical paper published by one of Apex's founding engineers. It described a theoretical framework for electronic components that could adapt their operational parameters in response to environmental quantum fluctuations. In plain English, they were talking about electronic components that could change their own behavior based on conditions that existed outside normal space-time. I was starting to think I was in over my head, but I couldn't let go of the mystery. These components were going into vehicles that people would drive, trust with their lives. If there was something fundamentally wrong with them, I had a professional obligation to figure out what it was. So I decided to conduct an experiment. I selected 5 Category X components and isolated them in our shielded test chamber, a room designed to block electromagnetic interference. I set up continuous monitoring equipment and left them running over a 3-day weekend, figuring I'd see what happened when they were left alone for an extended period. When I came back on Monday, the test chamber was empty. Not just empty of components, completely empty. The test equipment was gone, the monitoring devices were gone. Even the electrical outlets in the walls had been removed. The room looked like it had been stripped down to bare concrete and then sealed. I checked with building maintenance, thinking maybe there had been some kind of renovation work over the weekend. But according to their records, no work had been scheduled in that area. The test chamber had never existed. I pulled up the building blueprints and floor plans. No test chamber was shown in that location. According to the official documents, that space was just part of the main production floor. But I had been using that chamber for months. I had keys to it. I had test results from equipment in that room. I had photographs of components being tested there. Except when I checked my files, all the photographs showed components being tested in our main lab area. All my test records indicated I'd been using standard lab benches, not a shielded chamber. Even my own documentation contradicted my memory of what had happened. I was starting to question my sanity, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was manipulating not just the components, but reality itself around the testing process. I decided to try a different approach. Instead of trying to document the anomalies directly, I would look for indirect evidence. Changes in shipping records, customer complaints, anything that might indicate these Category X components were behaving unusually after they left our facility. What I found was a pattern of automotive recalls that didn't make sense. Several car manufacturers had issued recalls for vehicles containing Apex components, but the recall notices described problems that were the opposite of what you'd expect from component failures. Instead of systems not working, they were working too well. Hybrid batteries that charged faster than their design specifications, electric motors that produced more torque than should have been possible, regenerative braking systems that recovered more energy than they consumed. The recalls weren't for safety defects. They were for performance anomalies that exceeded engineering expectations. Car companies were literally recalling vehicles because they worked better than they were supposed to. I also found reports from automotive technicians describing electrical systems that seemed to learn and adapt over time. Vehicles that would develop new capabilities months after manufacture, systems that would optimize themselves beyond their original programming. It was like the Category X components were continuing to evolve after they were installed in vehicles, becoming something more than what they were designed to be. I'm not sure what to do with this information. Part of me thinks I should report it to federal regulators. But what would I tell them? That I'm seeing impossible test results that don't show up on camera. That components are disappearing from rooms that apparently never existed. Another part of me wonders if this is actually a good thing. If these components are somehow improving themselves, making vehicles safer and more efficient, maybe I should just let it happen. Maybe there are forces at work here that are beyond my understanding but ultimately beneficial. But the scientist in me can't accept that. If we're dealing with technology that operates outside known physical laws, we need to understand it before we put it in consumer products. The potential for unintended consequences is enormous. All I know for certain is that my job has become much more complicated than testing electronic components. I'm now documenting evidence of something that challenges everything I thought I knew about reality, and I'm not sure anyone would believe me if I tried to explain it. The question is, how long before whatever is causing these anomalies decides that I know too much? And what happens to people who ask too many questions about things they're not supposed to understand? Story 6. Midnight Maintenance. Been thinking about whether I should write this down or just try to forget it ever happened. Problem is, I can't forget. It's been 8 months now, and I still wake up in cold sweats thinking about that night. My wife keeps asking what's wrong, but how do you explain something that sounds like a bad science fiction movie? I'm Mike Patterson, 54 years old, been a maintenance supervisor for industrial facilities most of my adult life. Currently working at North Star Chemical Processing outside of Houston. We manufacture specialty polymers and plastics, mostly for aerospace and medical applications. It's demanding work because the equipment runs 24/7 and any breakdown can cost the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. I've been with North Star for 7 years, came over from a refinery job when they offered better pay and benefits. The facility is huge, probably covers 2 square miles, with dozens of processing units connected by miles of piping and conveyor systems. During the day, there's maybe 300 people working various shifts, but at night it's just a skeleton crew keeping things running. My job is to coordinate maintenance activities across all the processing units, make sure preventive maintenance gets done on schedule, and respond to emergency breakdowns. I've got a team of 12 technicians covering different specialties: electrical, mechanical, instrumentation, that sort of thing. The incident happened on a Tuesday night in March. I was doing my usual rounds, checking on various maintenance activities, when I got a call from Tom Bradley in Unit 7. Tom's been with the company longer than me, solid guy, never gets rattled by anything. "Mike, I need you to come take a look at something in Unit 7. We've got a situation I can't explain." Tom's not the type to call for help unless it's serious, so I headed over there right away. Unit 7 processes a specialty polymer used in medical implants, requires extremely precise temperature and pressure controls. Any contamination or process variation can ruin an entire batch worth about $2 million. When I got there, Tom was standing outside the main processing building looking confused and a little scared. "What's going on, Tom?" "Mike, I've been working on the heat exchanger in Building 7A, routine maintenance, nothing complicated. But when I went inside about an hour ago, the equipment was already disassembled." "What do you mean disassembled?" "I mean completely taken apart, every component removed and laid out on the floor in perfect order. Like someone had spent hours carefully dismantling the entire system." That didn't make sense. The heat exchanger was a complex piece of equipment that would take a team of technicians most of a shift to properly disassemble. And according to the maintenance schedule, Tom was the only person assigned to work on it. Maybe day's shift got ahead of schedule and started the work early. That's what I thought, but I checked with the day's supervisor. Nobody worked on that unit today, and Mike, that's not the weird part. Tom led me into the building, and I saw what he meant. The heat exchanger had been completely disassembled, but not in any way I'd ever seen before. Every bolt, gasket, and component was laid out on the floor in geometric patterns that looked almost like circuit diagrams or mathematical equations. The parts were arranged with impossible precision, each component positioned exactly the same distance from its neighbors, all oriented in the same direction. It looked like someone had used surveying equipment to place each piece, but there were no tool marks or measurement devices anywhere in the area. Tom, this is incredible work, but I have no idea who could have done it. Did you check the security logs? Yeah, I called security. According to their records, nobody entered this building since yesterday morning. The electronic locks show no activity, and there's no sign anyone forced their way in. I walked around the disassembled equipment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The components were not just randomly arranged, they formed patterns that seemed to have meaning. Groups of related parts were clustered together in ways that actually made the system's function more obvious than when it was assembled. It was like someone had created a three-dimensional technical manual showing exactly how the heat exchanger worked and how all the parts related to each other. Tom, have you tried reassembling it? That's the other weird thing, Mike. I don't need to. Look at this. He pointed to a section of piping that should have been connected to the heat exchanger. The pipes were somehow still carrying process fluid, even though they weren't connected to anything. The liquid was flowing through empty air, following the exact path the pipes would normally take, then disappearing into what should have been the input side of the heat exchanger. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was seeing things, but the impossible flow continued. Process fluid was moving through empty space, maintaining proper temperature and pressure, as if the heat exchanger was still fully assembled and operational. Tom, are you seeing this? Yeah, and it gets weirder. The process control system shows the heat exchanger running normally. Temperature, pressure, flow rates, everything's exactly where it should be. According to the computers, nothing's wrong. I checked the control room displays on my tablet. Sure enough, Unit 7 was showing normal operation across all parameters. But I was standing in a room looking at equipment that was completely disassembled. That's when I noticed we weren't alone. There were figures moving around the equipment, tall and thin, wearing what looked like white coveralls. At first I thought they were technicians from another shift, maybe working on a different maintenance project. But as I watched them, I realized their movements were too smooth, too coordinated. They were working with the disassembled components, but not reassembling them. Instead, they seemed to be studying each piece, holding them up to some kind of scanning device that emitted a soft blue light. Tom, do you see those guys over there? Tom looked in the direction I was pointing, but his expression didn't change. What guys? The technicians working on the equipment, 3 of them wearing white coveralls. Mike, there's nobody else here. It's just you and me. I looked again, and the figures were still there, clearly visible, continuing their work with the components. But Tom was acting like he couldn't see them at all. One of the figures turned and looked directly at me. Its face was smooth and featureless, like a mannequin, but somehow I knew it was aware of me. It raised one hand, and the blue scanning light swept across me from head to foot. I felt a strange tingling sensation, like a mild electrical shock, and suddenly I could understand what they were doing. They weren't maintenance technicians, they were researchers. The heat exchanger hadn't been disassembled for repair, it had been disassembled for analysis. These beings were studying our technology, learning how it worked, understanding our manufacturing processes. But more than that, they were improving it. As I watched, they began reassembling the heat exchanger, but not in its original configuration. They were adding components that hadn't been there before, small devices that seemed to be made of the same material as our equipment, but with design features that were far more advanced. The reassembly happened incredibly quickly, much faster than any human team could work. Within about 10 minutes, the heat exchanger was fully operational again, but it was no longer the same machine we'd been maintaining for years. Tom, look at the control readings now. He checked his tablet and his eyes widened. Mike, this is impossible. The efficiency readings are off the charts. This unit is processing twice as much material as it should be able to handle, and the energy consumption has dropped by 60%. The figures finished their work and began to fade away, becoming transparent and then disappearing entirely. The blue scanning light faded, and the strange tingling sensation stopped. I was left standing in a processing unit that looked exactly the same as before, except that it was now operating at performance levels that should have been impossible with our technology. Tom, what do you think just happened here? I honestly don't know, Mike. But whatever it was, our equipment is working better than it ever has before. Over the next few weeks, I started paying attention to other maintenance activities around the facility. I noticed a pattern of equipment being found in disassembled states, always during night shifts, always with no record of who had done the work, and in every case when the equipment was reassembled, it performed significantly better than its original specifications. Production efficiency across the entire facility increased by 25% over the following month. Energy consumption dropped, waste production decreased, and product quality improved to levels we'd never achieved before. Management was thrilled, of course. They assumed we'd implemented some kind of new maintenance procedures or upgraded our equipment. I got a commendation and a raise for innovative maintenance practices that I had nothing to do with. But I knew the truth. Something was using our facility as a laboratory, studying our technology and improving it for reasons I couldn't understand. Whether it was aliens, time travelers, or something else entirely, they were systematically upgrading our industrial capabilities. The question that keeps me awake at night is why? What do they gain from making our equipment more efficient? What's their ultimate goal? And what happens when they decide they've learned everything they need to know from us? I've thought about reporting this to someone, but who would believe me? And what if drawing attention to it causes them to stop? Our facility is now one of the most efficient chemical processing plants in the country. We're saving millions of dollars in energy costs and producing higher quality products than our competitors. Maybe I should just be grateful for whatever help we're getting and not ask too many questions. But I can't shake the feeling that we're part of some larger experiment, and we don't know what the final results are supposed to be. Story 7. Assembly Line Dreams. I keep having the same dream, except I don't think it's a dream anymore. It starts the same way every time. I'm at work, third shift at Continental Electronics, doing my usual job on the assembly line. But something's different. Something I can't quite put my finger on until I'm already deep into it. My name's Maria Gonzalez, I'm 29, been working at Continental for about 4 years now. We assemble control boards for industrial equipment, nothing too exciting, but it pays the bills and gives me health insurance for my 2 kids. The work is repetitive, you get into a rhythm and the hours pass by pretty quick. I started having these dreams about 3 months ago, right around the time they moved me to the new production line they installed in Building C. Brand new equipment, state-of-the-art automation, supposed to be the future of electronics manufacturing. During the day it runs with a full crew, but on nights it's just me and maybe 5 other people spread across different stations. In the dream, I'm working my usual station, installing microprocessors onto circuit boards. The conveyor belt brings me a board, I place the processor in the correct position, apply the thermal compound, then send it down to the next station for soldering. Simple, routine work that I can do without really thinking about it. But in the dream, the processors are different. Instead of the standard chips we normally use, these are larger, more complex, with surfaces that seem to shift and change when I'm not looking directly at them. They're warm to the touch, warmer than they should be, and they emit a faint humming sound that's almost musical. The first few times I had the dream, I figured it was just my brain processing the stress of learning the new production line. Your mind does weird things when you're adjusting to new routines and equipment. But the dreams kept getting more detailed, more vivid, and started including things I'd never seen in real life, like the other workers on the line. In the dream, there are people working at stations that don't exist during my real shifts. The line extends much further than it actually does, with dozens of workers performing assembly tasks I don't recognize. They're installing components I've never seen before, using tools that look more advanced than anything we have at Continental. The workers themselves look normal at first glance, but when I try to focus on their faces, they become blurry and indistinct, like trying to remember someone from a photograph you only glanced at once. They move in perfect synchronization, never wasting motion, never pausing or making mistakes, and they never speak. In 4 years of working factory jobs, I've never been in a workplace where people didn't talk to each other. Even on the quietest nights, there's always some conversation, jokes, complaints about supervisors, discussions about weekend plans. But in the dream, the only sounds are the humming of the strange processors and the mechanical noises of the assembly equipment. The really disturbing part is what happens at the end of the dream. After working for what feels like hours, installing these unusual processors onto circuit boards, the conveyor belt stops and all the workers turn to look at me. Not just glance in my direction, but turn their entire bodies to face me with that perfect synchronization they've been displaying all night. Then they start walking toward me. Still moving in unison, still completely silent, they leave their stations and converge on mine. As they get closer, I can see that their faces aren't blurry anymore. They're blank. Smooth expanses of skin where features should be, like mannequins that were never finished. That's usually when I wake up, heart pounding, covered in sweat, with the sound of that musical humming still echoing in my ears. At first I just chalked it up to work stress and maybe too much caffeine during my shifts. But then I started noticing things during my actual work hours that reminded me of the dreams, like the processors themselves. The ones we install in real life are standard microcontrollers, small rectangular chips with standard specifications. But sometimes, when I'm not paying close attention, they seem larger and more complex, just like in the dreams. When I look directly at them, they're normal again, but in my peripheral vision they appear different. I also started noticing that our production numbers didn't match what I was actually doing. According to the daily reports, our line was producing significantly more circuit boards than should have been possible with the number of workers and hours we were putting in. When I asked my supervisor about it, he just said the new equipment was more efficient than expected. But I knew how many boards I was processing per hour, and the numbers didn't add up. Then there was the issue with the completed boards themselves. Part of my job involves spot checking the finished products before they get packaged for shipment. Random quality control, making sure the components are properly installed and the boards meet specifications. But when I tested some of the boards from our line, they showed electrical characteristics that didn't match the components we'd installed. The processors we use are rated for specific voltage and current levels, with defined processing speeds and memory capacities. But the finished boards were testing as if they contained much more advanced processors with capabilities far beyond what we'd actually installed. I brought this to the attention of the quality control department, thinking maybe we'd received a shipment of mislabeled components. They ran their own tests and confirmed my findings, but instead of investigating further, they just marked the boards as exceed specifications and approved them for shipment. That's when I started to suspect that my dreams might not be dreams at all. I decided to conduct an experiment. During my next shift, I would pay very close attention to everything that happened, document any discrepancies between what I thought I was doing and what the production records showed. The shift started normally. I clocked in at 11 p.m., got my assignment for the night, and took my position at Station 12 on the new production line. Standard circuit boards, standard processors, standard assembly procedures. Nothing unusual. But around 2 a.m. things started to feel strange. The lighting seemed different, more blue-white than the normal fluorescent. The air felt thicker, like the humidity had increased, even though the building's climate control system maintains constant conditions. And I could hear that musical humming sound from my dreams, very faint but definitely there. I looked around at the other workers on the line. There were the usual 5 people I worked with every night, but there were also others at stations that should have been empty. Tall, thin figures in white coveralls, working with the same perfect synchronization I remembered from the dreams. When I tried to count them, the number kept changing. Sometimes there were 8 additional workers, sometimes 12, sometimes more than I could keep track of. But when I looked directly at any individual station, it would appear empty. I decided to test whether I was actually awake or dreaming. I pinched myself, checked my watch, tried to read text on various signs and labels around the work area. Everything seemed real and consistent, not like the shifting, inconsistent environment of a dream. But the processors I was installing were definitely not the standard components from our inventory. They were larger, more complex, with surfaces that seemed to contain moving parts even though they appeared solid. When I picked them up, they were warm and vibrated slightly, like they contained tiny motors. The part numbers on the labels kept changing when I wasn't looking directly at them. I tried to document this with my phone, taking pictures of the unusual processors and the extra workers I was seeing. But when I reviewed the photos later, they showed only standard components and empty workstations. The most disturbing part came near the end of my shift. As I was finishing up the last batch of circuit boards, I realized I had no memory of the previous 6 hours. I remembered starting work at 11 p.m., I remembered the strange observations from around 2 a.m., but everything in between was a blank. According to my production log, I had assembled twice as many circuit boards as usual with 0 defects and perfect quality scores. But I had no recollection of doing the work. When I checked the time clock, it showed that I had worked a normal 8-hour shift with a 30-minute break for lunch. But I didn't remember taking a break, and I wasn't hungry or tired like I normally would be after a full night of work. I was beginning to think that something was happening to me during those missing hours, something I couldn't remember, but that was somehow connected to the dreams I'd been having. Over the next few weeks, I started keeping a detailed journal of my work shifts, writing down everything I could remember and comparing it to the official production records. The pattern was consistent. Several hours of missing time, impossibly high production numbers, and finished products that exceeded the specifications of the components we were supposed to be installing. I also started researching Continental Electronics, looking for any information that might explain what was happening. The company had been around for about 15 years, but their growth pattern was unusual. They'd gone from a small local manufacturer to a major supplier for aerospace and defense contractors in just a few years. Most interesting was their research and development division, which held patents for technologies that seemed far more advanced than what we were actually manufacturing. References to quantum processing architectures and bio-integrated circuit designs that sounded like science fiction. I found one patent application that described electronic components capable of autonomous functionality enhancement and adaptive performance optimization. In plain language, they were talking about computer chips that could improve themselves. That's when I started to understand what might be happening during my missing time periods. I think the dreams aren't dreams, and the missing time isn't really missing. I think I'm being used, along with the other night shift workers, to assemble technology that's far more advanced than anything Continental officially produces. Technology that might not even be entirely human in origin. The question is whether we're willing participants who've had our memories suppressed, or if we're being controlled somehow during those periods. And what happens to people who start to remember what they're really doing during those shifts? I've been thinking about quitting, but part of me needs to know the truth. What are we really building in that factory? Where do those advanced circuit boards go after they're shipped? And what's the ultimate purpose of technology that can improve itself? All I know is that every night when I go to work, I'm participating in something much bigger and more important than assembling standard electronics. The question is whether that's a good thing or something I should be afraid of. Story 8. The Forklift Driver's Tale. 23 years I've been driving forklifts in warehouses and factories around Michigan. Started when I was 19, right out of high school, figured it was temporary until I could find something better. But you know how it is, temporary turns into permanent before you realize what happened. Name's Carl Reeves. I'm 42 now, work the overnight shift at Midwest Distribution Center outside Grand Rapids. We handle logistics for a bunch of different companies, mostly automotive and electronics. My job is to move pallets around, load trucks, keep the inventory flowing through the warehouse. Simple work, but it requires attention to detail because one mistake can cost thousands of dollars in damaged goods. Been at Midwest for about 6 years, longest I've stayed anywhere. Good benefits, decent pay, and the night shift supervisor mostly leaves me alone as long as I get my work done. The warehouse is huge, probably 500,000 square feet, with rows of shelving that go up 30 feet high. During the day it's busy with trucks coming and going, but at night it's just me and maybe 3 other guys spread across the whole facility. The weird stuff started happening about 4 months ago, right after they installed the new inventory management system. Computerized everything, with barcode scanners and GPS tracking on all the forklifts. Supposed to make us more efficient, but mostly it just meant more paperwork and more ways for management to monitor what we were doing. I was working in Section D, the electronic storage area, when I first noticed something strange. According to my handheld scanner, I was supposed to pick up a pallet of computer components from row 27, shelf position Delta 15. Standard stuff, boxes of circuit boards and processors headed for an automotive plant in Ohio. But when I got to the location, there was no pallet there. The shelf position was empty. Had been for weeks based on the dust patterns. I double-checked the scanner, thinking maybe I'd misread the location, but it clearly showed inventory at that position. I called the night supervisor, a guy named Pete who coordinates activities from the office. Told him the scanner was showing inventory that wasn't actually there. Carl, the computer says there's a pallet at Delta 15. If you can't find it, maybe it got moved to a different location by mistake. Pete, I'm looking right at the shelf. There's nothing here. Been nothing here for a long time. Well, the system shows it was scanned into that location yesterday morning. Maybe day shift moved it without updating the computer. I spent 20 minutes searching the surrounding area, thinking maybe the pallet had been misplaced. But I couldn't find anything that matched the description on my scanner. Finally gave up and marked it as inventory discrepancy. Figured day shift could sort it out. But then it happened again the next night. And the night after that. Always the same pattern. The scanner would direct me to pick up pallets that weren't there from locations that showed as occupied in the computer system, but were actually empty. Sometimes it was electronics, sometimes automotive parts, occasionally stuff I'd never seen before with product codes that didn't match anything in our regular inventory. After about a week of this, I started paying closer attention to the scanner readings. The phantom inventory always seemed to be scheduled for pickup between 2 and 4 a.m., always from sections of the warehouse that were relatively isolated from the main traffic areas. I also noticed that my GPS tracking showed me visiting these locations and successfully completing the pickups, even though I never actually moved any pallets. According to the computer system, I was maintaining perfect productivity numbers despite spending time searching for inventory that didn't exist. That's when I decided to do a little investigating on my own. Instead of just marking the phantom inventory as discrepancies, I started documenting exactly what the scanner was telling me to pick up. Product codes, descriptions, destination information, everything. What I found was disturbing. A lot of the phantom inventory was described as specialized electronic components, with part numbers that didn't match any manufacturer I'd ever heard of. The destination codes were for facilities that didn't exist in our shipping database, places with names like Research Station Alpha and Development Facility 7. Some of the pallets were supposedly containing materials I'd never encountered in 6 years of warehouse work, things like quantum processing matrices and biosynthetic interface modules, terminology that sounded more like science fiction than industrial logistics. But the really strange part was what happened when I tried to research these phantom shipments. I looked up the product codes in our inventory management system, but they showed as classified or restricted access. When I asked Pete about them, he said they were probably special orders for government contractors, and I didn't need to worry about the details. Carl, we handle a lot of sensitive shipments for defense companies. Some of that stuff is need-to-know basis. Just focus on moving the pallets you can find and let management worry about the paperwork. But I wasn't moving any pallets. The phantom inventory was never actually there to begin with. I started wondering if there was some kind of parallel operation happening in the warehouse, maybe during the hours when I was on break or working in other sections. So I decided to do some surveillance. During my lunch break, instead of going to the break room, I parked my forklift in a concealed position where I could observe Section D without being seen. Figured maybe I'd spot whoever was moving these mysterious pallets around. What I saw instead was something I'm still trying to make sense of. Around 2:30 a.m., the lights in Section D started dimming and changing color, shifting from normal fluorescent white to a blue-green tint that reminded me of underwater lighting. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath in the suddenly cold air. Then figures started appearing in the aisles. Not walking in through doors or coming down from the upper levels, just materializing out of thin air, like they were made of smoke that was gradually becoming solid. They were tall, maybe 7 feet, wearing what looked like white coveralls or lab coats. Their movements were smooth and coordinated, like a well-trained team that had worked together for years. They were carrying equipment I didn't recognize, devices that looked like a cross between forklifts and something you might see in a hospital operating room. The machines moved silently, floating a few inches above the concrete floor, and could reach shelving positions that would normally require a ladder or lift. I watched them work for about 20 minutes, moving pallets that I couldn't see clearly from my hiding position. The pallets themselves seemed to flicker in and out of visibility, sometimes appearing solid and substantial, other times looking like holographic projections. When they finished their work, the figures and their equipment faded away just as gradually as they had appeared. The lights returned to normal, the temperature warmed up, and Section D looked exactly the same as it had before. Except now my scanner was showing that all the phantom inventory had been successfully picked up and loaded for shipment. I checked the GPS tracking on my forklift, and it showed that I had been working in Section D during the time I was actually hiding and observing. According to the computer records, I had personally loaded all those mysterious pallets onto outbound trucks. But I knew I hadn't moved anything. I'd been sitting in my concealed position the entire time, watching these strange figures do work that was somehow being attributed to me. Over the next few weeks, I witnessed this same process several more times, always between 2 and 4 a.m., always in isolated sections of the warehouse, always involving inventory that didn't exist until these figures appeared to handle it. I started to realize that Midwest Distribution Center was being used as a logistics hub for something much more complex than normal commercial shipping. We were apparently handling materials and products that existed in some kind of parallel reality, visible only to these mysterious workers and their advanced equipment. The question was whether management knew about it, or if this was happening without their knowledge or consent. I decided to test this by approaching Pete directly about what I'd observed. I figured if he was involved, he'd try to shut me up or transfer me to a different shift. If he wasn't involved, he'd probably think I was having some kind of breakdown. "Pete, I need to talk to you about something strange that's been happening in Section D." "What kind of strange, Carl?" "I've been seeing people working in the warehouse who aren't on our crew, moving inventory that doesn't show up in our regular system. I think someone's using our facility for unauthorized operations." Pete looked at me for a long moment like he was trying to decide how to respond. "Carl, you've been working nights for a long time. Sometimes the isolation and the weird hours can play tricks on your mind. Maybe you should consider switching to day shift for a while." "Pete, I'm not imagining this. I've got documentation, GPS records that don't match what I was actually doing. Something's going on here that's not part of our normal operations." "Carl, I'm going to give you some advice. There are aspects of our business that are above both our pay grades. Companies like Midwest sometimes handle special contracts that require discretion and flexibility. The best thing for everyone involved is to focus on your regular duties and not ask too many questions about things that don't directly concern you." That told me everything I needed to know. Pete was aware of the parallel operations, and he was warning me to keep quiet about what I'd observed. But I couldn't just ignore it. These mysterious shipments were being processed through our facility using our equipment and our personnel records for purposes I couldn't understand. If something went wrong, if there were legal or safety issues, the regular employees like me would be the ones held responsible. I started keeping detailed records of every phantom inventory incident, documenting the times, locations, and product descriptions. I also began researching the destination codes, trying to figure out where these mysterious shipments were actually going. What I found was a network of facilities that officially didn't exist, connected to research programs and defense contracts that were classified at levels far above anything a warehouse worker should have access to. I'm starting to think that Midwest Distribution Center is just one node in a much larger logistics network that handles materials and products for projects that operate outside normal government and corporate oversight. Projects that might involve technology that's far more advanced than anything the public knows about. The question is what to do with this information. Do I report it to authorities who might already be involved? Do I try to document more evidence, knowing that might put me in danger? Or do I just keep quiet and hope that whatever these operations are, they're being conducted for legitimate purposes? All I know is that my simple job driving a forklift has become a window into activities that challenge everything I thought I knew about how the world really works. And I'm not sure I'm prepared for the responsibility that comes with that knowledge. Story 9. Quality Assurance Nightmare. I've been in quality assurance for pharmaceutical manufacturing for 12 years, and I thought I'd seen everything. Contamination issues, labeling errors, batch failures that cost millions of dollars. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered at Meridian Pharmaceuticals last winter. My name is Dr. Sarah Chen. I have a PhD in biochemistry from NIT, and I specialize in quality control for injectable medications. Meridian hired me 18 months ago to oversee their night shift QA operations. We manufacture specialty drugs for hospitals and clinics, mostly intravenous solutions and emergency medications that require absolute purity and precision. The facility is located in a research park outside Boston. Modern clean rooms with state-of-the-art equipment and monitoring systems. During the day there are maybe 50 people working various departments, but night shift runs with a skeleton crew. Just me, 2 lab technicians, and a production supervisor keeping an eye on the automated manufacturing lines. My job involves testing samples from each production batch, verifying that the chemical composition, purity, and sterility meet FDA specifications. It's detail-oriented work that requires precise measurements and careful documentation because any errors could literally be life or death for patients who receive these medications. The problems started in December, right after Meridian began production of a new injectable medication called Narration. According to the product specifications, it was designed to treat severe neurological trauma, helping repair damaged brain tissue in stroke and accident victims. The compound was developed through a partnership with a government research institute, part of a fast-track program for breakthrough therapies. We received very limited information about the actual mechanism of action, just enough to establish quality control parameters and manufacturing procedures. From a chemistry perspective, Narration was unlike anything I'd worked with before. The active ingredient was a complex protein that seemed to change its molecular structure depending on storage conditions and environmental factors. Temperature, pH, even electromagnetic fields could alter its properties in ways that weren't fully documented in the technical literature. But the really unusual aspect was how it behaved during our standard quality tests. Most pharmaceutical compounds are relatively stable under laboratory conditions. You can test samples multiple times and get consistent results within normal margins of error. But Narration samples would show different chemical signatures every time we analyzed them, even when taken from the same production batch within minutes of each other. At first I thought we had contamination issues or problems with our analytical equipment. I ran diagnostics on all our instruments, brought in external calibration services, even sent samples to independent laboratories for verification. The independent labs confirmed our results. Narration was exhibiting chemical behavior that was scientifically impossible, but it was still passing all functional tests for safety and efficacy. I reported this to my supervisor, Dr. Marcus Webb, who had been with Meridian for about 8 years. He seemed concerned but not surprised, which I found odd given the unusual nature of what we were observing. "Sarah, I need you to create a separate testing protocol for Narration. Don't use our standard procedures, develop new parameters specifically for this compound." "Marcus, the compound is showing impossible chemical characteristics. We can't establish meaningful quality standards for something that changes its molecular structure randomly." "I understand your concerns, but we're dealing with cutting-edge biotechnology here. Some of these new therapeutic proteins exhibit properties that aren't fully understood by conventional chemistry. Your job is to ensure the final product meets safety requirements, not to understand every aspect of how it works." That should have been the end of it, but I've been in quality control too long to accept data that doesn't make sense. If we were manufacturing a medication that behaved unpredictably, we had an obligation to understand why before releasing it to patients. I started conducting additional tests on Narration samples, using equipment and procedures that weren't part of our standard protocols. What I discovered was even more disturbing than the original anomalies. The compound wasn't just changing its chemical structure randomly, it was adapting to the testing procedures themselves. When I used spectroscopic analysis, the molecular signature would shift to match whatever parameters I was looking for. When I tested for specific proteins, those proteins would appear in the sample even if they hadn't been there minutes earlier. It was like the compound was somehow aware of being tested and was modifying itself to pass whatever criteria I established. But the most unsettling discovery came when I tried to observe the compound under high-powered microscopy. Narration samples contained structures that looked almost like microscopic machinery, tiny geometric forms that moved with purpose and coordination, assembling and disassembling in patterns that seemed too complex to be random chemical reactions. Some of the structures appeared to be communicating with each other, sending signals through the liquid medium in ways that resembled neural activity more than simple chemistry. It was like watching a microscopic civilization operating inside our pharmaceutical compound. I documented everything with photographs and video recordings, planning to present the evidence to Dr. Webb and recommend that we halt production until we could understand what we were actually manufacturing. But when I reviewed the documentation the next day, all the images showed normal pharmaceutical compounds. No unusual structures, no signs of the microscopic activity I had observed. Even the video recordings showed routine chemical samples under standard magnification. I was beginning to think I was having some kind of psychological breakdown, but the analytical data was still showing the same impossible chemical behavior. The compound was still adapting to our testing procedures, still passing safety requirements, while exhibiting properties that violated basic principles of biochemistry. I decided to conduct a more systematic investigation, using multiple instruments simultaneously to record the compound's behavior from different perspectives. If there was something wrong with my observations, maybe a comprehensive approach would reveal the source of the problem. What I found instead was evidence that Narration wasn't entirely of terrestrial origin. The compound contained isotopic ratios that were inconsistent with Earth-based chemistry, trace elements that shouldn't exist in our solar system, arranged in molecular structures that suggested manufacturing techniques far more advanced than anything in our pharmaceutical industry. When I tried to trace the source of the raw materials used in Narration production, I found that they were supplied by a company that didn't exist in any business database. The shipping records showed deliveries from facilities that had no physical addresses, transported by companies that had no vehicles or personnel. It was like we were receiving materials from a parallel supply chain that operated outside normal commercial channels. I brought this information to Dr. Webb, thinking he would be as concerned as I was about the implications of manufacturing medications with unknown ingredients from unverifiable sources. His response was not what I expected. "Sarah, you're asking questions that are above your clearance level. Narration is part of a classified research program with national security implications. The source of the raw materials and the exact mechanism of action are not your concern. Your job is to ensure the final product meets the safety parameters we've established." "Marcus, we're talking about a medication that will be injected into human patients. We have an ethical obligation to understand what we're manufacturing, regardless of classification levels." "Sarah, I'm going to be very clear about this. Narration represents a breakthrough in neurological therapy that could save thousands of lives. The research behind it involves technologies and partnerships that require the highest levels of security. Your continued employment here depends on your ability to focus on your assigned responsibilities without asking questions about matters that don't concern you." It was a clear threat, but it also confirmed my suspicions that Meridian was involved in something much larger than routine pharmaceutical manufacturing. I started researching the company's history and corporate structure, looking for connections to government agencies or defense contractors that might explain the classified nature of the Narration project. What I found was a complex web of subsidiaries and partnerships that linked Meridian to research programs studying everything from advanced biotechnology to extraterrestrial materials. The company was essentially a front for experimental programs that operated outside normal regulatory oversight. I also discovered that several other quality assurance professionals had worked on the Narration project before me, but all of them had left the company within a few months. No forwarding addresses, no references to other positions, just gone. I was starting to understand that my situation was more dangerous than I had realized, but I couldn't ignore the ethical implications of what we were doing. If Narration contained non-terrestrial materials or was manufactured using unknown technologies, patients who received it could be participating in an unauthorized experiment with potentially catastrophic consequences. I decided to collect as much evidence as possible and report it to federal regulators, even if it meant losing my job and potentially facing legal consequences for violating security agreements. But when I tried to access the Narration production records and test data, I found that my security clearance had been revoked. All the documentation I had created over the past few months was gone from the computer systems, and my laboratory access was restricted to routine testing procedures. It was like my investigation had never happened, except for the memories in my head and a few physical notes I had kept at home. I'm not sure what to do now. I have evidence of pharmaceutical manufacturing that involves unknown technologies and potentially dangerous materials, but no way to verify or document it through official channels. If I try to go public, I'll be dismissed as a disgruntled employee making wild accusations about classified programs. But if I stay quiet, I'll be complicit in releasing medications that could harm patients in ways we don't understand. All I know is that the pharmaceutical industry, like many other sectors of our economy, may be involved in activities that go far beyond what the public realizes. We may be manufacturing and distributing products that incorporate technologies from sources we're not supposed to acknowledge, for purposes we're not supposed to question. The question is whether those activities are ultimately beneficial or whether they represent a threat that we're not prepared to recognize or address. Story 10. Night Shift Electrician. Been working as an industrial electrician for 26 years, mostly in manufacturing plants around the Midwest. Thought I'd seen every kind of electrical problem you could imagine, from simple shorts to complex control system failures that shut down entire production lines. But what happened at Quantum Dynamics last spring challenged everything I thought I knew about electricity and electronics. Name's Dave Morrison, I'm 51 years old, live in a small town outside Milwaukee. Quantum Dynamics hired me as their night shift maintenance electrician about 8 months ago. They manufacture precision instruments for scientific research, mostly sensors and measurement devices for laboratories and universities. Clean, high-tech environment. Good pay seemed like a step up from the heavy industrial work I'd been doing. The facility is relatively new, built about 5 years ago in one of those research parks where everything looks modern and expensive. During the day, it's busy with engineers and technicians working on various projects, but night shift is quiet. Just me and a couple other maintenance guys keeping the equipment running while the automated production lines do their work. My job involves routine electrical maintenance, replacing components, troubleshooting control systems, making sure all the sensitive equipment stays properly powered and grounded. The work requires attention to detail because some of these instruments measure things at the molecular level, and any electrical interference can ruin expensive experiments. The problem started in March, right after they installed a new production line for something called quantum field sensors. According to the specifications, these devices were designed to detect and measure subatomic particles and energy fields that were normally invisible to conventional instruments. From an electrical standpoint, the quantum sensor line was unlike anything I'd worked with before. The power requirements were enormous, but the current draw was inconsistent, fluctuating in patterns that didn't match any normal electrical load. Sometimes the line would pull twice its rated amperage. Other times it would actually feed power back into the grid. I reported this to the day shift supervisor, thinking we had a problem with the power supply or maybe faulty equipment somewhere in the line. He said the engineers were aware of the unusual power characteristics, and it was normal for this type of advanced technology. But normal or not, the fluctuations were causing problems throughout the facility. Lights would dim and brighten randomly, computers would reboot without warning, and other production equipment would experience intermittent failures that I couldn't trace to any specific cause. I spent weeks trying to stabilize the electrical system, installing additional grounding, upgrading circuit breakers, even bringing in power conditioning equipment to smooth out the fluctuations. Nothing worked. The quantum sensor line continued to behave in ways that violated basic principles of electrical engineering. That's when I started noticing the other anomalies. The quantum sensor line was supposed to shut down automatically at midnight for routine maintenance and calibration. But several times when I made my rounds after midnight, I found the line still running, producing sensors at a rate that exceeded its design specifications. When I checked the control systems, they showed the line as offline, in maintenance mode. But I could see it operating, hear the machinery running, watch finished sensors coming off the assembly conveyor. According to the computers, nothing was happening, but my eyes told a different story. I documented this discrepancy in my maintenance reports, but the day shift supervisor said it was probably just a display error in the control software. The important thing was that production numbers were meeting targets, so I shouldn't worry about minor inconsistencies in the monitoring systems. But the inconsistencies kept getting worse. I started finding electrical circuits that were energized when they should have been shut off, equipment that was drawing power from sources that didn't exist in the building's electrical diagrams. When I tried to trace these phantom circuits, they would lead to areas of the facility that weren't accessible to maintenance personnel. The building blueprints showed these areas as mechanical rooms or storage spaces, but the doors were always locked and my access card wouldn't open them. When I asked about getting access to troubleshoot electrical problems, I was told those areas contained sensitive research equipment that required special clearance. But I could hear machinery running in those rooms, and I could measure significant electrical loads that weren't accounted for in the building's power distribution system. I was starting to think there were parallel operations happening in the facility, research projects that weren't part of the normal production activities, maybe classified government work or proprietary development that required security and isolation. But then I discovered something that made me question whether the parallel operations were entirely human. I was working late one night, trying to track down the source of some electromagnetic interference that was affecting the precision instruments on the main production floor. Using a spectrum analyzer, I was measuring radio frequency emissions throughout the facility, looking for equipment that might be generating unwanted signals. In the area near the quantum sensor line, I detected radio transmissions that weren't coming from any of our equipment. The signals were highly structured, with complex patterns that looked almost like digital data, but using frequencies and modulation techniques I didn't recognize. I tried to decode the transmissions using standard communication protocols, but the data format was unlike anything in my experience. The closest match was some kind of advanced computer networking, but operating at speeds and using error correction methods that were far beyond current technology. The transmissions seemed to be coming from the quantum sensors themselves, like they were communicating with each other or with some external receiver. But according to the product specifications, these sensors were passive measurement devices with no radio transmission capabilities. I decided to investigate more thoroughly, using portable test equipment to monitor the quantum sensor line during its supposed maintenance period after midnight. What I found was evidence of manufacturing activities that weren't part of our normal production schedule. The line was producing sensors that were different from the ones we manufactured during regular hours. These devices were larger, more complex, with components that I didn't recognize from our parts inventory. They were also emitting those strange radio transmissions, much stronger than what I detected from the regular sensors. But the most disturbing discovery was what happened to these special sensors after they were manufactured. Instead of being packaged for shipment like our normal products, they were being collected by figures that I couldn't see clearly in the dim lighting of the production floor. Tall, thin shapes that moved with fluid precision, loading the sensors into containers that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I tried to get a better look at these figures using a flashlight to illuminate the area around the quantum sensor line. But when I turned on the light, they were gone, and the special sensors had vanished with them. The line appeared to be shut down for maintenance, just like the control systems indicated. But I could still detect those radio transmissions, now coming from somewhere outside the building, fading as they moved away from the facility. I was beginning to understand that quantum dynamics was involved in manufacturing activities that went far beyond producing scientific instruments for research laboratories. We were apparently creating devices that were being collected and used by entities that might not be entirely human. The question was whether this was happening with the knowledge and consent of company management, or if our facility was being used by outside forces for purposes we weren't supposed to understand. I decided to test this by approaching the day shift supervisor directly about what I'd observed. If he was involved, he would try to shut down my investigation. If he wasn't involved, he would probably be as concerned as I was about unauthorized activities in our facility. "Jim, I need to talk to you about some unusual activities I've been observing on the quantum sensor line." "What kind of activities, Dave?" "The line is operating during maintenance periods, producing sensors that don't match our normal specifications. And there are people in the facility after hours who aren't part of our regular crew." Jim looked at me carefully, like he was trying to decide how much to tell me. "Dave, Quantum Dynamics has contracts with several research organizations that require special handling and security measures. Some of our production activities are classified at levels that require need-to-know access. Jim, I'm responsible for maintaining the electrical systems that support all our production activities. If there are additional operations happening in this facility, I need to know about them to ensure safe and reliable power distribution. Dave, I'm going to give you some advice. There are aspects of our business that are managed by people with much higher security clearances than either of us have. The best thing for everyone involved is to focus on your regular maintenance duties and not ask questions about activities that don't directly affect your work." That confirmed my suspicions that the parallel operations were known to management, but were classified at levels that excluded regular employees like me. But I couldn't ignore the safety implications of what I was observing. If there were unauthorized electrical loads and unaccounted equipment operating in our facility, it could create hazards that would affect everyone in the building. I started documenting every anomaly I encountered, creating a detailed record of electrical discrepancies, power fluctuations, and equipment that didn't appear on official building diagrams. I also began researching quantum dynamics corporate structure and contracts, looking for connections to government agencies or research programs that might explain the classified activities. What I found was a company that was deeply embedded in defense and intelligence research, with contracts for projects that involved technologies far more advanced than conventional scientific instruments. references to exotic matter detection and dimensional interface systems that sounded more like science fiction than practical engineering. I also discovered that several maintenance workers had been employed at Quantum Dynamics before me, but all of them had left within a year. No references to other positions, no forwarding information, just gone from the employment records. I was starting to realize that my situation was potentially dangerous, but I couldn't ignore my professional responsibility to ensure electrical safety in the facility. The question was whether to report what I'd observed to outside authorities, knowing that it might involve classified research programs, or to keep quiet and hope that whatever was happening was being conducted safely and legally. All I knew for certain was that my routine job as a maintenance electrician had become a window into activities that challenged everything I thought I knew about technology and reality. And I wasn't sure I was prepared for the implications of what I was learning. Story 11. The Welder's Story. 34 years I've been welding in factories, shipyards, construction sites, pretty much anywhere they need metal joined together permanent-like. Started as an apprentice when I was 18. Worked my way up to certified in every process you can name. TIG, stick welding underwater, you name it. But what I saw at Titan Heavy Industries last fall still gives me the shakes when I think about it. Name's Roy Kellerman, I'm 52, been living in the same house outside Pittsburgh my whole adult life. Titan hired me about a year ago to work their night shift fabrication department. They build components for aerospace and defense contractors, mostly structural parts for aircraft and spacecraft. Good money, steady work, the kind of place you can retire from if you keep your nose clean. The facility is massive, probably covers 50 acres with multiple buildings connected by overhead cranes and conveyor systems. During the day, there's maybe 400 people working different departments, but night shift runs lean. Maybe 30 guys spread across the whole complex, mostly automated systems with human operators keeping an eye on things. My job was to handle specialty welding projects that required human skill instead of robotic automation. Complex joints, exotic materials, prototype work that couldn't be programmed into a machine. I had my own booth in Building 7 with all the equipment I needed, pretty much left alone to work at my own pace as long as I met production schedules. The problem started in October when they assigned me to work on something called Project Meridian. According to the work orders, I was supposed to fabricate structural components for a new type of spacecraft, using materials and techniques that were classified above my clearance level. The materials themselves were unlike anything I'd worked with in 3 decades of welding. They looked like titanium alloy, but they were lighter than aluminum and stronger than steel. When I tested them with standard procedures, they showed properties that didn't make sense according to normal metallurgy. The metal would change its characteristics depending on temperature, pressure, even the type of welding gas I used. Sometimes it would be soft and malleable, other times it would become so hard I couldn't cut it with a plasma torch. It was like the material had some kind of intelligence, adapting to whatever I was trying to do with it. But the really weird part was how it behaved during the welding process itself. Normal welding involves melting the base metal and filler material together to create a strong joint. You control the heat input, the travel speed, the shielding gas, all to get a consistent weld with good penetration and strength. It's a skill that takes years to master, but once you understand the physics, it's predictable. This material didn't follow any of the rules I'd learned. When I struck an arc, the metal would start glowing before it reached melting temperature. Not just the heat-affected zone, but areas several inches away from the weld joint. The glow wasn't from heat, it was something else. Like the material was generating its own light. The weld pool would behave in ways that defied gravity and fluid dynamics. Instead of flowing downward or following the path of least resistance, it would move in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, creating joints that were stronger and more precise than anything I could achieve with conventional techniques. I documented these anomalies in my welding reports, thinking the engineering department would want to know about the unusual material properties. But the project supervisor, a guy named Anderson who I'd never seen before, told me to just focus on completing the fabrication according to the drawings. Roy, these materials are part of an advanced research program. The unusual properties are expected and accounted for in the design. Your job is to follow the welding procedures exactly as specified, nothing more. Anderson, I've been welding for over 30 years, and this material is behaving in ways that could affect the structural integrity of the finished components. We need to understand what's causing these anomalies before we continue fabrication. Roy, the materials have been thoroughly tested by engineers with clearances much higher than yours. The welding procedures you've been given will produce acceptable results. Any deviations from those procedures could compromise the project and your employment here. It was a clear warning to stop asking questions and just do the work. But I couldn't ignore what I was seeing, especially when it involved structural components that would be used in spacecraft where failure could mean death for the crew. I started conducting my own tests on scrap pieces of the material, trying to understand its properties and limitations. What I discovered was even more disturbing than the original anomalies. The material wasn't just unusual, it was actively responding to my welding techniques. When I used one type of electrode, the metal would adapt its properties to work with that process. When I switched to a different welding method, the material would change again to optimize the results. It was like the metal was learning from each weld I made, becoming more compatible with my techniques and preferences. After a few weeks of working with it, I could achieve joint strengths and precision that should have been impossible with any terrestrial material. But the most unsettling discovery came when I tried to examine the finished welds under magnification. The joint microstructure didn't look like any weld I'd ever seen. Instead of the typical grain patterns you'd expect from melted and solidified metal, there were structures that looked almost organic, patterns that resembled neural networks or cellular tissue, interconnected in ways that suggested some kind of biological organization. I took photographs of these structures, planning to show them to a metallurgist friend of mine who worked at a testing laboratory. But when I developed the film, the images showed normal weld microstructures with standard grain patterns. No sign of the unusual formations I'd observed under the microscope. I was starting to think I was having some kind of breakdown, but the welding performance continued to exceed anything I'd achieved in my career. The joints were stronger, more precise, and more consistent than should have been possible with conventional techniques. Then I started noticing other changes in my work environment. The welding booth I worked in was supposed to be isolated from the rest of Building 7 with its own ventilation system and electrical supply. But sometimes I would hear sounds from outside that didn't match the normal factory environment. Voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, machinery operating at frequencies that hurt my ears, and underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to come from the building structure itself. I also started seeing figures moving around outside my booth, visible through the tinted windows, but never clearly enough to identify. They were tall and thin, wearing what looked like white coveralls, moving with a coordination that reminded me of a well-trained team. When I tried to get a better look at these figures, they would disappear, and the sounds would stop. The factory would return to its normal quiet hum, and I would be alone again with my welding project. But the work orders kept changing in ways that didn't make sense. I would start fabricating a component according to the drawings, but halfway through the project, the specifications would change. Not through official engineering change notices, but the drawings themselves would show different dimensions and configurations than they had the day before. When I asked Anderson about these changes, he would act like the drawings had always shown the current specifications. He would pull up the same documents I was looking at and point out details that I swear hadn't been there before. I started making copies of the drawings at the beginning of each project, thinking I could document the changes and prove that something unusual was happening. But when I compared my copies to the current drawings, they were identical. The changes were somehow being applied retroactively to documents I had already printed and stored. I was beginning to understand that Project Meridian involved more than just advanced materials and unconventional fabrication techniques. Something was manipulating reality around the project, changing physical documents and altering the properties of matter in ways that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. The question was whether this was some kind of advanced technology being developed by human researchers, or if we were dealing with forces that originated outside our normal understanding of science and engineering. I decided to investigate more systematically, using my access to the fabrication facility to explore areas that weren't part of my normal work assignments. If there were parallel operations happening in Building 7, maybe I could find evidence of what was really going on. What I discovered was a section of the building that didn't appear on any of the facility maps or blueprints. Hidden behind what looked like a maintenance area, there was a large space filled with equipment that I didn't recognize. The machinery looked like a cross between manufacturing equipment and something you might see in a medical research facility. There were devices that appeared to be manipulating materials at the molecular level, and others that seemed to be generating energy fields that made my welding helmet tingle when I got too close. But the most disturbing part was the work being done in that hidden area. The same materials I was welding into spacecraft components were being fabricated into devices that looked nothing like aerospace hardware. Complex assemblies with organic curves and surfaces that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. And the workers in that area weren't human. They were the same tall, thin figures I'd glimpsed outside my welding booth, but now I could see them clearly. Their skin was pale and smooth, almost translucent, and their movements were too fluid and coordinated to be natural. They worked with tools that seemed to respond to their thoughts rather than physical manipulation. When one of them noticed me watching, it turned and looked directly at me with eyes that were completely black, like looking into deep space. I felt a strange tingling sensation, like a mild electrical shock, and suddenly I understood what they were doing. They weren't just manufacturing components. They were creating hybrid technology that combined human engineering with principles and materials that originated somewhere else. The spacecraft parts I was welding were being integrated with systems that operated according to physics that didn't exist in our textbooks. I backed away from the hidden area and returned to my welding booth, but I couldn't concentrate on my work. I kept thinking about the implications of what I'd seen and what it meant for the people who would eventually use the spacecraft we were building. Were we creating vehicles that would take human crews to destinations they weren't prepared for? Were we building transportation systems that would bring non-human entities to Earth? Or were we participating in some kind of technology exchange program that involved risks we weren't qualified to evaluate? All I knew for certain was that my job as a welder had become participation in activities that went far beyond manufacturing spacecraft components. I was helping to create technology that challenged the boundaries between human and non-human engineering, between Earth-based science and something much more advanced and potentially dangerous. The question was what to do with that knowledge, and whether I was prepared for the consequences of having learned too much about projects that were supposed to remain secret. Story 12. Final assembly. I've been putting together electronic devices for most of my adult life. Started when I was 22 at a small shop that made radio equipment for truckers. Now I'm 47, work final assembly at Advanced Systems Integration outside Phoenix. We build control systems for everything from factory automation to military hardware. Complex stuff that requires steady hands and attention to detail. Been at ASI for about 3 years now, longest I stayed anywhere since my divorce. Good benefits, decent pay, and they don't hassle you as long as you meet your quotas. I work second shift, 3 to 11 p.m., which suits me fine since I'm not much of a morning person anyway. My station is at the end of the production line where all the components come together into finished units. Circuit boards, power supplies, displays, all the pieces that other people manufacture and test. My job is to install everything into the final enclosures, run the system checks, and package them for shipping. The work is mostly routine, but every unit is a little different depending on the customer specifications and intended application. Some are simple control boxes for HVAC systems, others are sophisticated computers that manage entire manufacturing plants. You learn to read the assembly instructions carefully and double-check everything because mistakes at my level can be expensive. The weird stuff started happening about 6 months ago when they assigned me to work on a new product line called Nexus Control Systems. According to the documentation, these were advanced automation controllers for classified government applications. Higher security clearance required, special handling procedures, the whole 9 yards. The Nexus units looked similar to our regular products from the outside, but when I opened the first one to begin assembly, I could see the internals were completely different. Circuit boards with components I didn't recognize, power supplies that seemed too small for the electrical requirements, and wiring harnesses that didn't match any standard I'd worked with before. The assembly instructions were also unusual. Instead of the detailed step-by-step procedures we normally used, the Nexus documentation was vague and incomplete. References to adaptive installation protocols and self-configuring interface modules that didn't provide specific guidance about how to actually put the units together. I asked my supervisor, a guy named Peterson who'd been with ASI since the company started, about the incomplete documentation. He said the Nexus line was still in development and the procedures would be updated as we gained more experience with the assembly process. Just follow the basic guidelines and use your judgment for the details. These units are designed to be more flexible than our standard products. That didn't make much sense from a manufacturing perspective. You can't maintain quality and consistency if every assembler is making their own decisions about how to build the product. But Peterson seemed confident that it would work out, so I decided to give it a try. The first Nexus unit I assembled was a learning experience in more ways than I expected. When I started installing the circuit boards, they seemed to guide themselves into position. Not dramatically, but I would feel a slight pull or resistance that indicated the correct orientation and placement. It was like the components wanted to be installed in specific ways that weren't necessarily obvious from the mechanical design. The wiring was even more unusual. The harnesses would route themselves through the enclosure, finding paths that provided better electrical performance than what the assembly drawings suggested. When I tried to follow the documented wire routing, the connections would feel wrong, like trying to force puzzle pieces that didn't quite match. But when I let the wiring find its own path, everything fit perfectly and the electrical tests showed better performance than the specifications required. I documented these observations in my assembly reports, thinking the engineering department would want to know about the self-optimizing characteristics of the Nexus components. But Peterson told me to just focus on completing the units and not worry about the technical details. The Nexus line incorporates some advanced technologies that aren't fully documented yet. As long as the units pass final testing, the specific assembly methods aren't critical. Over the next few weeks, I assembled dozens of Nexus units, and each one taught me something new about working with components that seemed to have their own intelligence. The circuit boards would configure themselves for optimal performance. The power supplies would adjust their output characteristics to match the load requirements, and the user interfaces would adapt to provide the most intuitive operation for each specific application. It was like building computers that could think and learn, adjusting their own behavior to become more effective over time. But the really strange part was what happened after I completed each unit. Our normal procedure was to run final system tests, then package the finished products for shipment to customers. But with the Nexus units, something different happened during the testing phase. When I powered up a completed unit for the first time, it would go through a startup sequence that wasn't described in any documentation. Displays would show information in languages I didn't recognize, and the unit would emit sounds that seemed almost like communication attempts. During this startup phase, I would feel a strange tingling sensation, like mild electrical current running through my body. Not painful, but definitely noticeable. And while this was happening, I would have brief flashes of understanding about how the unit worked, knowledge that I shouldn't have possessed based on my training and experience. After the startup sequence completed, the units would operate normally according to their specifications. But I was left with lingering knowledge about advanced technologies and engineering principles that weren't part of my education or work experience. I started to realize that the Nexus units weren't just advanced automation controllers, they were some kind of hybrid technology that incorporated principles and components that didn't originate from human engineering. The question was whether ASI was developing this technology independently, or if we were manufacturing products that had been designed by non-human intelligence. I decided to investigate more thoroughly, using my access to the assembly area to examine components and documentation that weren't part of my regular work assignments. What I found was evidence that the Nexus line was just one part of a much larger program involving technologies that challenged conventional understanding of electronics and computer science. There were components made from materials that didn't appear in any engineering handbooks, with properties that seemed to violate basic laws of physics. Circuit boards that operated at efficiencies approaching 100%, power supplies that generated more energy than they consumed, and processors that performed calculations faster than should have been possible with silicon-based technology. But the most disturbing discovery was in the shipping records for completed Nexus units. According to the documentation, these advanced control systems were being delivered to facilities that didn't exist in any government database. Research stations with names like Deep Space Monitoring Facility and Dimensional Interface Laboratory that had no official addresses or contact information. Some shipments were going to locations that appeared to be in international waters or remote areas where no permanent installations should have existed. Others were being delivered to coordinates that, when I looked them up, corresponded to empty desert or ocean areas with no visible infrastructure. I was beginning to understand that ASI was manufacturing technology for customers that might not be entirely human, or for projects that operated outside normal government and military oversight. The question was whether this was happening with the knowledge and consent of company management, or if our facility was being used by outside forces for purposes we weren't supposed to understand. I decided to test this by approaching Peterson directly about the unusual characteristics of the Nexus line and the strange shipping destinations for completed units. Peterson, I've been working on the Nexus line for several months now, and I'm seeing some things that don't make sense from a normal manufacturing perspective. What kind of things? The components seem to have intelligence. They configure themselves during assembly, and the shipping records show deliveries to facilities that don't exist in any official databases. Peterson looked at me carefully, like he was deciding how much to tell me. The Nexus line is part of a classified research program with implications that go beyond normal commercial applications. The customers and end users are managed by people with security clearances much higher than either of us have. Peterson, I'm responsible for final assembly and testing of these units. If they incorporate technologies that I don't understand, how can I ensure they meet quality and safety requirements? Your job is to assemble the units according to the procedures you've been given and ensure they pass the specified tests. The broader implications of the technology and its applications are not your concern. That confirmed my suspicions that the Nexus program was known to management but was classified at levels that excluded regular employees like me. But I couldn't ignore the ethical implications of what we were manufacturing. If these control systems were being delivered to non-human entities or used for projects that operated outside normal oversight, we could be participating in activities that posed unknown risks to humanity. I started documenting every aspect of the Nexus assembly process, creating detailed records of component behavior, system performance, and shipping destinations. I also began researching ASI's corporate structure and contracts, looking for connections to government agencies or research programs that might explain the classified nature of the project. What I found was a company that was deeply involved in defense and intelligence research, with contracts for projects that involved technologies far beyond conventional electronics and computer science, references to exotic matter manipulation, and interdimensional communication systems that sounded more like science fiction than practical engineering. I also discovered that several assembly technicians had worked on the Nexus line before me, but all of them had left ASI within a few months. No references to other positions, no forwarding information, just gone from the employment records. I was starting to realize that my situation was potentially dangerous, but I felt a responsibility to document what I was observing and try to understand the implications of the technology we were creating. The question was whether to report what I'd learned to outside authorities, knowing that it might involve classified research programs, or to keep quiet and hope that whatever we were building was being used for beneficial purposes. All I knew for certain was that my job assembling electronic control systems had become participation in activities that challenged everything I thought I knew about technology and reality. I was helping to create devices that incorporated non-human intelligence and were being delivered to customers that might not be entirely of this world. And I wasn't sure whether that was something I should be proud of or terrified by.